And I'm hoping you're all seeing the title slide and that you can hear me clearly. So firstly, thank you for the introduction, and thank you. I just want to add an extra special thanks to Chris Friedrichs, who helped me a little bit and encouraged me to do this, and also came up with this rather brilliant subtitle, Soviet World War II Propaganda in Miniature. World War II, for people of my generation, is still living history, not because we remember or participated in it, but because our parents did. And for many of them, the experience changed them and thus us. Like many people whose father served in the war, the subject interested me. And of course, I asked my father about it. Like many veterans, he did not say much. It was long after he died that I had the common regret that I did not ask him more when I had the chance. This led me to reading more and more about the war. First, the campaigns he was part of, but one cannot help get drawn deeper and deeper into the topic once you get started. My impression of the war was very Brito-centric, if you'll pardon the expression. After all, my father had served in the British 8th Army. To me, when I was young, Winston Churchill rallied the British Empire, and his brilliant General Montgomery led the servicemen and women from the Commonwealth countries to destroy the Nazi peril. Oh yes, I thought they had some help from the Americans and maybe some other people. Of course, the real truth was very different. If I had grown up in Moscow or Kazan or St. Petersburg, I probably would have believed that the glorious Red Army won the war with some help, maybe in the form of trucks and other supplies from Britain and the US. But this talk is not about the war per se, it's about propaganda, and specifically a view of Soviet propaganda seen in miniature. And in two senses of the word miniature, the war was so vast, so all-encompassing, that I've chosen to focus on just a handful of the millions of stories that awful period of history in the world. And the second sense of miniature is because I'm going to focus on stamps, which are tiny, as I'll show you in a second, and yet the stories they try and portray are very large. And before I start telling the stories, I just have a couple of slides to lay the background for those of you less familiar both with postage stamps and with what the Russians still call the Great Patriotic War. So this part of it is a preface, and it will be very quick. The first adhesive postage stamp was introduced in Britain in May 1840, and there is a scan of it. It's very valuable today, although you can get them, and it featured the monarch's head, and that was very common to have leaders on the stamps, except that the Soviet Union introduced their first stamps 17 years later in December 1857, and they just featured the imperial crest on their stamps all the way up until a special issue on January the 2nd, 1913, celebrating the tercentenary of the founding of the Romanov dynasty. And I'm just showing a couple of the stamps. They had many in the series, all with heads of Romanovs, and 3, I think, with buildings that were the Kremlin and 2 other buildings that were Romanov property. So they were not that much interested in anything other than glorifying themselves or the imperial crest. This all changed as soon as the revolution occurred. The very first issue after the Bolsheviks took power was these 2 stamps you see on the bottom left, severing the chain of bondage. From the very start, the Bolsheviks were interested in iconography and propaganda. And as you know, and if you look at these stamps that came out in 24 to 31, also featuring faces, but rather than glorifying rulers or emperors or czars, they're featuring common people, the proletariat. So very telling, and we'll see that theme over and over again with the stamps I'm going to show you. I also want to just have 2 slides about the war in case you're not up on your Soviet World War II. On 22nd of June, 1941, remember, America had not entered the war yet. That only happened at the end of the year. The Germans invaded Russia on a very broad front. That's about an 1,800-mile front. And within 6 months had almost reached the steppes. They were within binocular view of the Kremlin by the end of December. This is a very big region. It's hard to fathom it. They couldn't use rail because the Russian rail system used a different gauge from the German rail system. So they were very reliant on, amazingly enough, horses and trucks and people walking. So the distances were very big. But the point is they they occupied, the Russian army at that stage was very disorganized, and there was some gallant fighting put up, but by and large, the Russian army collapsed and only started to rally towards the end of the year, helped by bad weather conditions and so on. But vast parts of the country were occupied. Just to give you some idea of the scale, if we overlay a map of British Columbia on this, you can see that the distance from Germany to Moscow is almost encompasses all of BC and Alberta. And the terrain is no less friendly. There's lots of swampland and so on, rivers to cross. Very difficult to fight a war in that part of the world during winter because of the weather. So the Germans then launched a second campaign in spring of 1942, but they decided this time to concentrate on the south. And I'm showing this map because one of the stamps I'm going to talk about involves some people fighting in a town called Krasnodon, which is either still called Krasnodon or maybe Sorokinya. I can't quite figure that out from Google Maps, but we'll talk about that a bit later. So this is the talk starting itself. In 1941, the first stamp on a war theme was this beautiful red stamp called Be a Hero, and featuring either a mother or a wife with the son looking anxious but keen to get involved in fighting. Now, interestingly enough, this stamp has to have been designed before the invasion started. They could not have put it out quickly enough. So clearly, in spite of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Germany and Russia, people must have realized that war was coming and could not be avoided. The interesting thing about the stamp is that it was designed by an artist named Viktor Boris-Turetsky. And by the way, please forgive my poor Russian pronunciation skills. There's the poster that he did. And I love comparing the poster with the stamp because a lot of it's the same. Look at the belt buckle, for example. That's very similar. And the hands are in the same place. But he's made the soldiers slimmer and fitter looking, in my opinion. And interestingly enough, the soldier's not looking back. Maybe he thought the poster was, I don't want to go. Whereas in the stamp, it's clear that this is a soldier who's ready to be a hero, and that he has the full support of, is it his mother or his wife? I can't really tell. Some captions say it's his wife, others say it's his mother. So what is a hero of the Soviet Union? This was an order that was established in April 1934, and it consisted of an award called the Order of Lenin, plus a gold star. And not only did it come with this commendation, but there were perks, and especially during the war, there were perks for the family, extra ration books and possibility of living in better quarters and so on. So it was a very highly regarded. And by the way, there's a complete encyclopedia put out by the Moscow Military Publishing House, I believe, that gives the encapsulated stories of all the heroes that have been awarded since 1934. And a lot of the stuff I'm going to read to you, I actually took from translations of that encyclopedia. So during the war, there were lots of stamps issued from the period that the war started, and some of them were on war themes, some of them were celebrating things that happened. There were many on war themes, but in particular, there were 3 issues, and these are the ones I'm going to talk about in this talk. There was the first set, December 1941. And we'll talk about each of these people and the stories behind it. Then in April 1944, so quite a gap, the young god of Krasnodon, a very fascinating story. And then finally in September 1944, another issue. So all these stamps feature people who were awarded the title, which is like Order of Canada, Hero of the Soviet Union. What fascinates me in particular when I started looking at these stamps is the amount of detail that they pack into each of the stamps. So to give you an idea of that, I thought it important to show you the scale. So the stamps are about 1 1/4 inch wide. They're less than an inch high, maybe 3 3/4 of an inch high. So these are the first series that I'm going to talk about today. But they pack such a story. So what I've done is taken a fancy camera and done the highest resolution photograph I possibly can, because I want you to share the amazing detail that's gone into the stamps. Now, from a graphic design point of view, this might be disastrous because I'm not sure who was going to sit looking at these stamps with the, with some sort of enlarger on them. So let's start with this one. Junior Lieutenant Talalikin ramming a German plane in midair. And here's the official story as reported in the military encyclopedia. And again, apologize for my Russian pronunciation. Viktor Vasilievich Talalikin was made a hero of the Soviet Union for being the first pilot in aviation history to ram an enemy bomber in flight. This was on August the 7th, 1941, in the skies above Moscow. He survived the ramming, but was killed in action on the 27th of October, 1941. The stamp shows his plane above the Moscow searchlights after ramming a clearly marked German bomber. The stamp includes a portrait of Talalikin and a depiction of the Gold Star Medal. Now, when I started looking at these stamps, I thought, well, how true are these stories? So I started doing a lot of digging around, and I found in the Vancouver Public Library a beautiful book written by Margaret Bourke-White, who, as you probably know, was a very daring photojournalist at the period. She was featured in the film by Gandhi, played by Candice Bergen, and the resemblance is actually quite amazing in my opinion, but that's a picture of Margaret Bourke-White. And she happened to be in Moscow at the time that Lieutenant Talalikin was being paraded around by the mayor of Moscow in order to serve propaganda purposes to the people. And she took a picture of him after he'd given one of these rousing speeches. And you can see his hand is still bandaged, presumably from injuries he sustained after he rammed a plane and presumably bailed out and lived. Sadly, as I said in the blurb, he died shortly after. So there's no doubt he was a real person, probably did ram a plane, and talked about it until he was tragically killed. The second stamp's also an aviator, and this story is a bit murkier. So here's Captain Gastello, whose plane was damaged so that it couldn't fly it anymore. And so what he did is dove into enemy gasoline tanks. And I love this stamp. I mean, it's tragic, but look at the little figures running away in terror at the bottom of the stamp. And remember, this is enlarged some, 10 times bigger than the size you would see it on an envelope. So the official story for this is that on June the 26th, 1941, Nikolai Gastello was on a bombing mission near Minsk. His plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire and started burning. Unable to extinguish the fire, Captain Gastello directed his aircraft into an enemy convoy. He perished along with his 3 crew. Now, he became almost instantly famous. For example, Rimsky-Korsakov wrote a song in his honor, but it does appear likely that he was created for propaganda purposes. His was one of the first awards made at a time when the Red Army was collapsing, and the Germans were advancing rapidly across most of the front. An investigation carried out in 1951 determined that the plane in question was actually flown by someone named Alexander Maslov. But because Gastello has been so widely mythologized, the investigation findings were concealed. It was also considered by aviation experts quite unlikely that a severely damaged plane could dive with sufficient accuracy to actually do any damage to a convoy. Now the stamps take an interesting turn. This is Alexander, or his nickname Shura Chikalam. And the official story is that 16-year-old Shura Chikalam engaged in guerrilla activities in the region of Tula near Moscow. And remember, the German army almost reached Moscow. In the first days of November 1941, he took part in an ambush of German vehicles, destroying one vehicle with a hand grenade. After becoming ill, Chikalam was bedridden, and his location was betrayed by a traitor. When Germans approached to arrest him, he threw a grenade at them, but it failed to explode. He was tortured brutally and hanged on November the 6th, 1941, and his body was left hanging for 20 days. Now, the stamp's interesting for a number of reasons. One minor point is this idea of traitor crops up frequently. The Russian propaganda machine was never willing to admit errors on its part or carelessness or even the superiority of German intelligence. So whenever something was discovered, it always seemed to come down to a traitor. And we'll come back to this with one of the later stamps. However, the rest of the story is almost certainly true. The German occupation was brutal from the outset. It had been indoctrinated by poisonous anti-Slav racism, and from the very earliest days of fighting, the Eastern Front earned a reputation for barbarism and cruelty. At the time, Soviet writer and Jewish journalist Ilya Ehrenberg wrote, and this is a quote, "For the first time, our people face not men, but cruel and vile monsters, savages equipped with every technically perfected weapon, scum acting according to rule and quoting science, who have turned the massacre of babies into the last word of state wisdom. Hatred has not come easily to us. We have paid for it with towns and regions, with hundreds and thousands of human lives." By mid-1942, there were 100,000 partisans active in the occupied regions. Shura Chikalam was very young, and he was hanged publicly, and his body was left hanging to discourage resistance. The German army was driven out of Tula as part of the Battle of Moscow, and his body was taken down and buried with full military honors. This is possibly the most famous of these young partisans, hero of the Soviet Union, Zoya Yanskaya. Again, a young woman. And the official story is that in the first months of the war, Yanskaya volunteered through the Moscow Komsomol that's a young communist organization, for active duty. She was assigned to work with an army detachment whose job was to encourage partisan activity behind enemy lines. In late November 1941, she was captured by the Germans and subjected to severe torture. Before being hanged, she never broke down under torture. Just before being hanged, she said, "German soldiers, give yourselves up before it's too late." When I tried to do the research and verify this story, I came across actual photographs taken by a German soldier of her being tortured and hanging, and they're way too disturbing to include in the talk, but it does attest to the truth of at least most of the story. It's hard to know whether or not she really said, "Give yourselves up." Other people reported that she said, "You cannot kill all 200 million of us," just before she was hanged. But she was hailed as a national heroine from the start and remains arguably the best known Soviet war hero. And I've seen photographs of Russian T-34 tanks with her name emblazoned on the side of the tank. When I mentioned that I was doing this research to somebody I worked with at Apple who was Russian, he immediately knew all about her. He had been taught about her in school. In spite of her iconic status, however, even she has been attacked by revisionists, by a revisionist historian. The claim is that local peasants complained to the Germans after she had burned some of their huts. But the pictures and so on, as I say, are shocking testimony to the brutality of that part of World War II. And the last in this series has led me to a great deal of extra reading, because at first I thought, yes, these first few stamps all show a very unprofessional, desperate acts by desperate people ramming a plane that's been blown down. And when I first looked at the stamp, I thought, this is so archaic. How is sabers going to be any effective weapon against tanks and machine guns and so on? So it turns out there's quite a lot to the story, and I can't go into it all, but I am going to tell you a little bit more about it. So the official story is this: in August 1941, General L.N. Dovitar was put in charge of a cavalry division made up of several Cossack regiments. This horse-mounted cavalry broke through enemy lines and penetrated the front line to at least 100 kilometers, causing panic amongst the enemy and inflicting a large number of casualties on them. On December the 11th, 1941, while General Dovitar was inspecting defenses, he was fatally wounded by enemy machine gun fire. The stamp shows General Dovitar leading a horse charge. There are so many layers to the stamp that this would deserve a 50-minute lecture of its own. Firstly, just to fill in some background, the Bolsheviks wanted to eliminate any notion of ethnicity to them, and they were very brutal, in particular against the Cossacks. And in fact, certain Cossacks have called that period of de-Cossacization, have called it a genocide. And indeed, many Cossacks were killed. So that's one aspect of this, is here's Cossacks fighting for the Red Army. The second interesting aspect is that Dovitar was Jewish. And in fact, the Soviet Union made great propaganda fact out of this. Apparently, now these Cossacks, by the way, were Cuban Cossacks. And I don't know a lot about Cossacks, but from my understanding is amongst Cossack living in the Don Basin and those areas of the southern part of Russia and Ukraine, children are trained in a military way from a very young age. They become superb horsemen, and they were naturally useful in war situations. Now, as I say, I thought this would be kind of useless against tanks and machine guns, but it turns out that because of the terrain, the horse-mounted cavalry was actually used right through World War II on the Eastern Front. And what they could do is come out of the forest, inflict damage, and disappear again. And so some of them carried rifles and could shoot from horseback. And the other factor is both armies, the Russian and the Soviet army, were very dependent on horses, as it turns out. And it also turns out that the German horses were really not up to the task of the fierce Russian weather conditions, whereas the horses that the Cossacks used were much more able to withstand the bitter cold of winter in that part of the world. But let's just get back to the Jewish question a bit, since this is the Temple Sholom Men's Club. I came across this article published by the Jewish Telegraph Agency of New York. And by the way, the Jewish Telegraph Agency, which was founded, I think, in the 1920s, is still going strong. And they were issuing daily bulletins. Now, remember that Lev Dovatar, the person whose picture you see there, was killed in 21st of December, 1941. In their newsletter dated Wednesday, February the 4th, 1942, they published this short article: Jewish general who led Cossack offensive against the Nazis killed in battle. And then they said, Moscow, February the 5th, ITA. The revelation that the Soviet general Lev Dovatar, famous commander of the Cossack troops who defeated the Germans at Rostov and caused their retreat along the entire Soviet front, was a Jew, is made today in the Red Star, official organ of the Soviet army. Reporting that General Dovatar died the death of a hero, the Soviet army newspaper emphasized the fact that under the Tsarist regime, the Cossacks were used to carry out pogroms against the Jews, while under the Soviet regime, they were led by a Jewish general and dealt smashing blows at the enemy. This, the Red Star says, is the sign of the great changes that have taken place in Soviet Russia. So I take that with a huge grain of salt, but it does show you the importance that propaganda played at that time of the war. Now, the other point about the stamp is Stalin had pretty much alienated, decimated, tortured, deported, moved almost every ethnic group in the Soviet Union. And suddenly in this war, they all had to be unified to fight a very, very difficult enemy. So a large amount of effort was made to move this away from being a socialist or Bolshevik revolution against capitalists into a great patriotic war to save the Soviets from the horde of the Nazi thugs. And this was just part of that propaganda effort. Okay, so then there was a gap for a couple of years before there were more hero stamps. And as I pointed out, in 42, the Germans invaded south and they occupied most of the Ukraine. And as you know, they got as far as what is now Volgograd, which was then Leningrad. And I'm just pointing the arrow at this little town, which was a small coal town in the Russian part of Ukraine. Actually, I should say, as of this moment, it's in Ukraine. Who knows whether it will be in Russia or Ukraine tomorrow at this time, because the Russians are making big noises about occupying that part. But anyway, the German army occupied it on July the 20th, 1942, and they liberated it in February the Russians liberated the town on February the 14th in 1943. And this stamp was issued. Now, this was unusual because it showed a group of people getting getting the title Hero of the Soviet Union. So this is an award of not to the individuals in the stamp, but to the organization, the Young Guards of Krasnodon. Now, the people in the stamp are Ulyana Gromova, Ivan Zemnyukov, Oleg Koshevoy, Sergei Tulenin, and Lyubov Shevstova. And I'm saying these names for a reason, we'll get into this. But here's the official story. When the town of Krasnodon was occupied by the invading German army in summer 1942, about 100 of the town's youths, members of the Komsomol, formed an underground resistance group called the Young Guard. Led by Gromova, Zemnyukov, Koshevoy, Tulenin, and Shevstova, these young heroes conducted a number of successful operations against the occupation forces. They were all captured and brutally tortured before being killed. Some were thrown down the shaft of a mine. The town was retaken in early 1943, and these stories of these brave young men and women became quickly known throughout the Soviet Union. It turns out that this particular story is still controversial to this very day. Very quickly after these Russians had reoccupied the town, the writer Alexander Fadeev was sent to Krasnodon to get the story out, and he wrote a novel called The Young Guard based on his understanding of events, which was widely read and hugely influential. Its value for propaganda was such that Fadeev was forced to revive the novel and republish it in 1951 to elevate the role of the Communist Party. On the other hand, the people of Krasnodon itself were outraged from the start by the distortions in the book. It was always believed that the organization was betrayed by traitors within the Guard. So there's this idea of traitors again. The more modern reading is it was just skillful German intelligence, not a traitor, but there's still this stink in the air that there was a traitor within the organization. The question though was who these traitors were and who the true heroes were. Those Krasnodon families who tried to refute the book were often persecuted by the state. The state worked very hard to maintain the official myth. However, after Stalin's death, some elements of the myth were corrected. Over subsequent years, various other reports were commissioned, although their findings were not widely circulated. Post-perestroika research continues. A 2003 article in Pravda names the leaders of the Young Guard as Koshevoy, Shevtsov, Ostapenko, Ugurtsov, and Subotin. Notice that only Koshevoy and Shevstova are shown on the stamp. The most recent research suggests that Koshevoy should not be part of the list either. His role was distorted by his mother. Turns out she was one of the main sources used by the initial investigators, and it may even be the case, there's some hints that Fadeev had an affair with his mother and therefore made him the leader of this group. So this story continues, and of course we all know there's still huge tension between the Ukraine and the Soviet Union. In subsequent research, of course, these people are still glorified. So right today, if you visited Krasnodon in the eastern Ukraine, you could visit the Young Guard Museum, and there's a monument. And the only thing I haven't been able to do is read the inscription. Maybe someone can tell me during the question period, and which figures are represented in the statue would be an interesting thing to find out. I also came across this poster, which was apparently put up in the streets very quickly after the incident occurred all over unoccupied Soviet Union. Same artist, Boris Koretsky, who was the one that designed the first stamp that saying "Be a Hero" that I started the talk with. Now, after that issue, there was a complete shift in tone. So now we're looking at the stamp that was issued in, oh, sorry, I've missed the date, I think in 44. And this caption says, "Hero of the Soviet Union, Kampasha Nuradilov destroyed 920 fascists in battles." Now, where there's a tone shift is because the course of the war by 1944 had changed dramatically. Whereas before there was this desperate action by desperate retreating forces, it had become pretty clear that the Russians were likely to eventually win the war. And they were starting that in 1943, the Germans lost their last attempt at a summer invasion. And from then on, they were really on the defensive. Now, the defense was long and arduous and involved many tragic deaths. But nevertheless, it was a more professional Red Army that was now facing the German army. And this is reflected in the people who were awarded these hero stamps, for the most part, not completely true. So this stamp's interesting for that reason. This is a professional soldier using great skill to kill 920 fascists. I'm not sure who went out and counted the body. The official story is that during the Battle of Stalingrad, Kampasha Nuradilov was a commander of a machine gun platoon. On the 1st of September 1942, he was wounded in battle, but maintained his post, killing at least 920 enemies. He died later from his wounds while being taken to the field hospital. So the interesting thing about him is that he is Chechen and he has a Chechen name. So people would have known that. And many Chechens indeed did receive the award Hero of the Soviet Union. But in February 1944, before the stamp was issued, Stalin accused the entire Chechen nation of being traitors and ordered their deportation to Central Asia. Only in 1957 was the deportation order annulled. And although most of the deportees returned home, they faced violence and discrimination. Tension between the Chechens and the Russian state remain high to this day, as you know. So Cosmonaut, Yanskaya, Matrosov, Costello, these are extremely well-known names in Russia today, but very few people have now heard of Nuradilov. There is an entry for him in the brief bibliographic dictionary of Russian heroes that I referred to, but interestingly enough, when you go to the best websites on the topic, he's missing, possibly because of the current state of Russian-Chechen relations. So the stamp, here's the date. The stamp was issued in July 1944, several months after the Chechen deportation. It's probably the case that this design was approved because it was in the pipeline before the expulsion decree occurred. So whether or not that figure of 920 is inaccurate, it seems likely Kampasha Nuradilov was real, that he was wounded while manning his machine gun and that he later died of his wounds. Now, this is a curious stamp because it's a bit of a throwback to the early heroic, the heroic throwing of hand grenades in a suicide attempt. So it doesn't quite fit into my overall thesis. Here's the official story, however. Theodore Luzon studied at the Kuban Medical Institute. He enlisted in 1939, serving as a signalman. During a battle on the Northern Front in late 1941, he provided a radio link between his battalion commander and the commander of the regiment. Even though they were surrounded, when his position was stormed by fascist soldiers, he threw a grenade at their feet, blowing up his radio and killing himself and the enemy soldiers in the process. So as I say, another desperate act, but unlike Chikalam, he was not a teenager in an underground organization. He was a professional signalman, part of the Red Army. So in that sense, he's part of this cadre of professional soldiers. Now this one's a very interesting stamp. They're all interesting, what can I say? So in this case, the official story is Alexander Matveyevich Matrosov was killed in action on the 23rd of February, 1943. And the official story is in the frontline forces from 1942, submachine gunner in the 91st Rifle Brigade, 22nd Army on the Kalin battlefront, and member of the Komsomol, Private Matrosov, having used up all his ammunition, blocked up the embrasure of the enemy's pillbox with his own body during the Battle of 23rd of February, 1943, by the village of Chernushki, Loskniatsky district of the Besov region. This brave soldier paid with his life to aid the completion of his company's military assignment. This feat has become a symbol of courage, valor, fearlessness, and love for your homeland. Conferred the title of Hero of the Soviet Union on the 19th of June, 1943, posthumously. Now, I read that all out because this really stood out as being a different kind of entry from all the other ones I read of the period. The amount of detail, for example, which brigade he was in and which army he was on, which battlefront he was on. He belonged to the Komsomol. And the actual date of the battle, well, it turns out that date of the battle is also Red Army Day, which is named because of the first mass recruitment to the Red Army in Moscow and Petrograd on that day in 1918. The dictionary actually also mentions that he was brought up in an orphanage. The Wikipedia entry claims his name was something completely different and Russified, but that his name was Russified from his Bashkir name to avoid discrimination. Some sources claim the day Matrosov died was changed to coincide with Red Army Day, and dispute his apparently sacrificial act. For an army criticized for its recklessness with infantry lives, heroic self-sacrifice was very useful propaganda. So in this case, it's really a question mark whether he existed, whether he did these things, whether it happened on that day. This is Maria Semyonova Polivanova and Natalia Venediktovna Kovshova. And the official story is that Natalia Kovshova was planning to be an aeronautical engineer. Keen to serve the war effort, she was accepted into Central Women's Sniper Training School at the end of July 1941. Maria Polivanova trained at the same school. In October 1941, both women joined a Home Guard battalion that was transferred to the Northwest Front in January 1942. They both served with distinction. On August the 8th, 1942, a group of 3 snipers were cut off from their unit by an enemy attack. Although they killed at least 20 attackers, they eventually ran out of ammunition. They used 2 grenades to blow themselves up along with 10 enemy soldiers. The 3rd sniper, someone named Novikov, was not detected by the Germans and escaped. She reported the heroic deaths of Kovshova and Polivanova. They were the first women to be awarded Hero of the Soviet Union status. It was customary for towns, boats, roads, schools to be named after heroes. The school in Moscow that Kovshova and Polivanova attended was named after them, and a museum was created in the school. A new monument to them was unveiled on the 40th anniversary of their death in 1982 on the initiative of staff at the institute where they had both worked before the war. However, in 1991, the school was renamed Secondary School Number 1284 with English immersion, and the museum was turned into a classroom. Even back in 1984, a journalist who visited the school noticed that the deeds of Kovshova and Polivanova were no longer taught to first graders. I'm not really sure why they would have been downplayed. So that maybe some of the experts in the audience can answer that question. Again, notice the amount of detail. The German soldiers are dying in agony on the left-hand side of the stamp as they throw these grenades. Now, probably the most professional of all of these stamps is Boris Fektovic Staffanov, who was born on the 26th of August, 1915 and killed in flight on the 30th of May, 1942. He got 2 awards. That's why they're 2 stars showing. And the caption indeed says twice Hero of the Soviet Union, B. Safanov. The degrees were given on the 16th of September, 1941 and on the 14th of June, 1942. So 1 award when he was still alive and 1 posthumously. The official story is that Boris Safanov was one of the first Soviet fighter aces of the Great Patriotic War. He joined the Soviet Air Force in 1933 at the age of 18. Shortly after the start of the war, he worked with the RAF to learn to fly Hurricanes. He then instructed other Soviet pilots, and by September 1941, he had flown 130 operations and had shot down 11 enemy aircraft. And by the way, an ace is someone who has shot down 5 or more planes. In early 1942, Safanov joined one of the First Guard's elite fighter regiments. In this unit, he flew 234 operational missions, adding another 22 kills to his score. And my comments on this is that he is the only person featured on the stamps issued during the war who received 2 Hero Awards. His first award was issued just a month after Talalikin and several months before Chikalam's. So it's interesting that he was not selected for inclusion in the first series of Hero stamps. It's possible that he was still alive when the designs were chosen and therefore might have been considered ineligible to be on a stamp. An alternative explanation is that at the early stage of the war, the propaganda arm of the post office needed a different kind of hero, an ordinary person who rose above himself to commit an impossible act of heroism. A late 1943 or early 1944, when the final Hero series were planned, the tide of war had long turned. By this time, the Red Army was a mighty and unstoppable force led by competent professionals. Although all the heroes in this last series died fighting, they were representatives of this branch of the new self-confident army. And as you all know, by April of next year, the war ended. And I'll show you this extra stamp. It's not of a hero, but there's this lovely stamp showing the December 1945 celebration, I believe in Moscow. Yes, in Moscow. And I happened to find a photograph, which is very similar to the stamp. And that is it. I'm happy, if I can, to answer any questions that you might have.
David, do we have any questions in the chat box? Checking. I have to tell you, Michael, it was an absolutely fascinating talk. Here comes.
Here's something from Judy
Yes.
Morris. Maybe, were there any stamps commemorating the siege of Leningrad?
There was a special first day cover commemorating Leningrad, yes. You're testing my memory now, but the siege of Leningrad, sorry, no, that was, I believe there was a Leningrad stamp, but I can't remember offhand, sorry.
Michael, how did you get these stamps and get involved in this project?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. So for a while, I was commuting from Victoria to Vancouver. I lived in Victoria, but my job was in Vancouver. And my wife was still living in Victoria. So I would leave on a Monday morning, fly to Vancouver, work till Thursday. And in the evenings, I was exhausted. And I found that watching TV became oppressive. So it happened that there was a little stamp store near where I worked in Yaletown. And I walked in one day and I said, do you have any stamps specifically covering Soviet Union from 1941 until 1945? And the gentleman in the stamp store said, yes, indeed. And he brought out a little red box. And it turned out that the stamps cost, 10 cents each, 20 cents each. So I just bought one of each.
Yeah.
Of everything he had. The whole thing cost me about $10. And then I had a problem because they were all in Russian. So I bought a Russian-English dictionary. And I found it much more productive to sit in the evening after a hard day's work, looking at the stamps and trying to uncover the story behind them, than it was to watch yet another stupid sitcom on television. So, and then, anyway, one thing led to another, and these stories they all draw you in. There are other fascinating stamps from that period, and almost every one of them has a story that seemed to be worth pursuing.
And questions come in. I'm wondering if stamp collecting became as big a hobby in the Soviet Union as it was, or for many years in Western countries.
I'm not an expert on stamp collecting. Remember, I came at this from a historical point of view. The stamps were just a means to the history, but I can tell you the answer to that question, happen to know, is yes, it was huge in the Soviet Union, and there's still very active Soviet philatelic organizations that have survived from almost the time of the first imperial issues of stamps.
Another question. Postal mail has obviously declined with the rise of technology. What do you think, or do you know of the equivalent type propaganda today?
Someone else will have to answer that question. What propaganda? We're getting it all the time from Facebook and YouTube, and so it just has taken a different form. I mean, you only have to think of what happened in the US election to wonder to what extent propaganda swayed apparently almost half Americans to vote stupidly, in my opinion. So.
Could I just add that the Great Patriotic War is a fundamental myth, or fundamental origin story, as it were, of Russia now. I mean, there's a lot of attention paid in Russia to the Great Patriotic War, and part of that is expressed in terms of stamps, because every year in their annual output, the Russians produce stamps that commemorate various battles and various events and various people from World War II. So you can actually continue. I mean, you could have a collection of stamps from World War II, and now you can collect current stamps that look back at World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, if I may add, you've now caused me to unpack my own stamp collection, which goes back 100 and some odd years.
Well, that's great. You must have a lot of Palestine in your collection, Bill.
I have Palestine, and I have a lot of old stamps. But so I'm going to look at my Russian collection to see whether I've got any of those. I don't think so, but I may have some of the original stamps. The other thing, really not totally related, but you mentioned Rostov and the Cossacks. Nomi's grandparents lived in Rostov, and in about 1908 or 09, during the pogroms, escaped from there, and from there went to China, and that's the story starts from there, ending up here.
Well, in my subsequent reading about General Dobotar, I got a book recently, and it turns out although he was Jewish, he was very popular with the Cossacks. Apparently the Cuban Cossacks anyway completely hero worshipped him, and he had no trouble leading. That's the stories that we hear anyway. So.
But the
I don't know the story about Cossack anti-Semitism and leading pogroms. Perhaps one of the historians in the audience can answer that question. Were the Cossacks known for leading pogroms against Jews?
Absolutely. I don't know the full story, but absolutely they were, and hence many of the Jews left, as I said, including Nomi's grandparents.
Because of Cossack persecution.
Because of Cossack in the Rostov area. I don't know, Nomi and I don't know whether they lived right in Rostov, but certainly always knew that they came from Rostov, but whether within the city or in the environment of Rostov, we don't know. But yeah.
I'd like to say something about my parents. We came, I'm Lucy Lawfer, but I was Langer, and we had a stamp store at 432 West Pender. We arrived in Vancouver in 1942 as, I guess, Holocaust survivors, but my father had a job here. That's how we got in, but he didn't like his job. And what can you do if you're sort of from the intelligentsia of Europe, from Vienna, and a lawyer? You can't do anything except open a business of some sort. And the business he opened was his hobby, and it was stamp collecting. And we all learned so much. And when you mentioned that the stamps cost 10 cents and 5 cents, the kids, we were pressed into slave labor there, filling up albums with hinges, putting the stamps in one at a time so that kids could come and buy. And my parents have already died many years ago, but there's many Vancouverites that knew my parents' stamp store. It's a very interesting part of my own history. That's what I wanted to say.
The one that I stopped at was on the corner, I think, of Richardson and Helmkin in Yaletown.
That one, that you were here much later.
Oh, okay.
There was an all-nation stamp store, which was run by a Hungarian Jew, probably in a similar situation, somehow survived the war and came at that time. And there was another Jewish stamp dealer, but I've forgotten what his name was. But there were about 4 or 5. And there still are a couple of stamp stores because, of course, we had to sell our stamps when our parents passed away, and it wasn't simple. But now people don't buy stamps for a hobby or even something that Michael Levy did, which was for his interest and a type of relaxation, because the kids, we'd had a lot of kids. Of course, you didn't make money with a lot of kids, but kids came down instead of playing computer games and cards and sports cards and all of these different things. But now it's a different world. Not one of my children was interested one iota.
And I was one of Langer's customers frequently.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know who they were.
I'm Ernie Newbrin from San Francisco. And of course, we knew the Langers And when the first time we visited Vancouver, we visited your father's stamp store. And it's interesting because stamp collecting for our generation, it was something that a way of learning history, geography, and it was done by the late King of England, and it was a very informative hobby. But kids nowadays, I think there's too many distractions, television and computer games. But I can understand for Michael how it is relaxing because you're not distracted by external things. So you can focus on that and learn a lot. Clearly, Michael has learned a lot and seems to be self-taught about the history related to the scenes depicted in these stamps. And I think it's interesting. There's a lot of propaganda related to the Second World War, and most of it was in poster form. And Arthur Schick, you probably have seen exhibits of his work, was one of the leading Jewish artists who did anti-fascist, anti-Nazi propaganda posters. And that was far more common in the West for using posters rather than stamps. I think stamps is unusual and perhaps unique for the Soviet Union.
Can I respond to that?
So,
And I was kind of hoping someone might ask this question. There was an organization called Cosmonaut, and consisted of poster artists mainly, including the two posters I showed. And they produced not only stamp designs, but posters. And you're quite right. From the earliest days of Bolshevik takeover, posters were a huge part of the propaganda effort, especially given the fact that a large portion of the population at that stage was illiterate. And I have several books of Soviet era posters. And in fact, when I worked for Apple, I had two wonderful posters up on my wall, which were both relevant to the job. It's beautiful artwork. It only, and it's amazing to look at these collections of posters, but the Goznak committee was responsible for an overall approach to propaganda. And so they did banknotes, stamps, commemorative stamps, posters, and it was the same cadre of poster artists. And there was some wonderful art. It only got corrupted by Stalin's rather poor artistic taste. And so it moved into a kind of what they call the constructivist type with, you know, heroes with jutting chins. It moved from beautiful abstract art into these jutting chin proletariat looking forward and looking strong, which is too bad. It's still interesting from an art point of view, but not nearly as interesting as the 1920s work, in my opinion.
And what I found very interesting is that I'm preparing a course on the use of art in propaganda and protest. And I was focusing really on one of the topics was how posters and propaganda art was mostly, or a lot of it was related to anti-war pacifism. If you think of the Guernica famous painting that was exhibited at the Paris World Fair in 1936 or 38, that was a most powerful message for pacifism, as were Kietykolwitz's artwork. And so and you can go back to Goya. His art was anti-war. So I think overall, there's much more pro-pacifism art, and amongst the German secession, the Germans in the Weimar Republic who had experienced the First World War, a lot of their art was absolutely against war. But then certainly during the Second War, propaganda used posters that were pro-war.
So if you contact me offline, there's one series of stamps I think it was in the 1930s or maybe the late 1920s, which is beautiful artwork, really spectacular. They're long stamps, this commemorative issue, and they're strictly an anti-war message. And if you'll find them useful in your class, I'll be happy to direct you towards them. And I can send you a scan of them as well. Just
I would appreciate that. I'll send you my
get
email.
your email to me somehow and we can do that.
Yes.
Very interesting.
I am from the Soviet Union, so it was very interesting for me to hear another point of view, from West to this great patriotic war, and your explanation about propaganda. First of all, for me, during the war, you should use propaganda to defeat enemy. Always à la guerre comme à la guerre. It's French proverb. Therefore, if you don't concentrate all efforts, all will to defeat the enemy, you will lose. And in these stamps you show me, it's very interesting stamps. Some of them I saw, but some of them it's new for me, especially about this Chechen hero. Yeah.
Interesting.
And
But you heard of Yanskaya.
Sorry?
You had heard of Yanskaya and
Yeah.
Costello, Chikalam. You knew about those people from when you were living there?
But I would like to say that during the war and after that, Soviet Union was united country. And we felt ourselves as Soviet people. Of course, for example, I am Jew. My neighbor was Ukrainian, another neighbor was Kazakh and maybe Chechen. I know a lot of Crimea Tatars, but at moment of war, if you united, you will win.
That's true.
Therefore, the word of propaganda and your point of view to the propaganda in Soviet Union, it was strange for me.
Well, let me say this.
But I suppose that it's a common cliche that everything in the Soviet Union was bad, but nevertheless,
No.
even your worded desperate war.
Well, they
Was
okay.
desperate only in 1941.
Aslan, I'd like to
At the end
respond.
of 1941, at the Moscow, Germans was defeated.
I watched this too.
Let me respond to that. I appreciate your comments very much, and I did not mean to imply any disrespect, but I do want to point out a couple of things. Firstly, the war in the Soviet Union was a very different experience than it was for most Westerners. For most Westerners, war was something distant. They certainly were involved because if they were served, obviously they were involved, but many people lived far away from any actual real danger. They heard and they read news and they were anxious, but they were very distant. This was completely different for people in Russia. It was a very present and much more all-encompassing. So I do appreciate that, and I'm sorry if I gave the wrong impression, but for people of my parents' generation, only a fraction of them were directly involved in fighting. My father was, but my mother was home the whole time. What some of my uncles were too young to serve, so they knew about it, but only from stories. Whereas for people in certainly in all the occupied areas, of course, that life was terrible and brutal. So Westerners tend to have a more kind of dispassionate view of World War II than you would have had growing up in Russia. And I try to convey that at the beginning of the talk. So I'm sorry if and when I said desperate, I didn't mean to imply any disrespect to the Soviet Union. What I was saying is that it was desperate times because the Soviet Union armies in the early year of the war was very disorganized. And they weren't,
of
and
course.
it's only later that they became the mighty professional army that they needed to be to defeat a very efficient German army. So if I gave the wrong impression to you, I apologize for that.
Michael?
Yeah.
I'd like to add a little bit to this. I think I know quite a bit about World War II, especially the aspects that took place in Russia, etc. I think to put a context into it, first of all, more than 20 million Russians died in that war. Okay, and if you compare Allied losses, etc., World War II, you'll see how different, as you just emphasized in the last couple of minutes, the war was in Russia versus the war in Western Europe and certainly in the Pacific, etc. The thing to understand, I think this, and I am not for a minute disputing the importance and how propaganda can be used and misused. But what basically went on is there was an internal war in Russia between the Communist Party and the farmers. And as a result, in the late 1920s and the first couple of years of the 1930s, something over 5 million people died, about half of them for political reasons. They were starved because this was a political war that the only thing I can compare it to almost is the context between Republicans and Democrats in the last 4 years.
Not quite.
Think of that for a minute in terms of the degree of animosity. But by the Russian military forces were several times the higher officers removed and more politically correct people put in there. The Russian army was never ready for the outbreak of World War II. That's right. When the Germans attacked. But what basically happened with the tank forces, they could go and move very quickly. And the Russian strategy during those years was, during the first year, is to essentially let them gradually come deeper and deeper, because they remembered how Napoleon was defeated, okay, about more than 100 years earlier, right?
By the winter.
By the winter. And that was part of their strategy. And in the meanwhile, roughly speaking, between December of 1941 and the next 6 months, the Russian army was in behind the front, reorganized, etc. And they made a stand at Stalingrad and later, 1 year later, at Leningrad, okay? And it was in this context that these individual stories about the stamps has taken place. All I'm trying to go and emphasize in that is that there was tremendous aftermath, various emotions involved, whether you were for the government or against the government. But basically, there was no doubt that practically all of the Russians, with one exception, were essentially against the Germans. but the Germans went in the Ukraine and some of the eastern part of the Russia had essentially collected Russian people, which were predominantly of German origin, who before World War II, between the two wars, some of them came from Germany, the Volga Germans. And
Yeah.
these people, there were several divisions, okay, 1 or 2 divisions that of these Russian, called them traitors in a sense, who fought on the German side against the Russians. So
Robert, I appreciate what you're saying, but I did point out this was a story in miniature because, as I said early on, there's so much to talk about.
yeah,
And this is part of the problem, is you get drawn deeper and deeper in. So I try to just highlight a few of the stories, because we could go on, we could have a whole, multi-year course in study in this period of history. There was so much going on. So I appreciate what you're saying, but I try to focus on these few stories. And
Yeah.
I am an amateur historian, so I regret if you feel I'm lacking in knowledge. I'm fascinated to hear this extra stuff, but I did just try and focus on these particular people that were highlighted by being featured and stamps issued in that era.
what I'm trying to suggest is that this conflict between stories, what was reality and what was embroidery, is because of the previous and then existing internal conflicts in Russian society,
Okay, no,
Russian
that's a good point.
community.
But
Yeah,
that's
no, that's a very good point. Yeah.
Ephraim, join the conversation.
Hi. Since I was born and lived for 20 years in the Soviet Union before I left in 1977, repatriated to Israel, and so I had some first-hand experience. I was a Komsomol member too, unfortunately. Anyway, what I want to add, not about so much about stamps, although I did collect stamps when I was young, but not political stamps, but stamps of foreign exotic countries. That was my direction, my interest. Interesting points. I don't know, guys, if you know anything about beginning of the Second World War, how this happened. I had the luck to read a couple of books written by Russian historians, published now after Perestroika, when it was finally a little bit of freedom of speech in Soviet Union, like it was not Soviet Union anymore, in Russia. So what happened in 1941, in June, war started on June 22nd of 1941. Stalin amassed an enormous amount of military technique and personnel on the border of a Soviet Union border, on the western border. And plan of Stalin was to march through the Europe and bring the socialism to the Europe. If he succeeded, the world would be a completely different place. But what happened, somehow Hitler ruined these plans by starting the war about 2 weeks prior to Stalin running his troops over the border. So Germans started first. And what happened is Russian army was completely unprepared. Because it was in their plans was to conduct offensive offense, not defense, and it's completely different war doctrine, offensive doctrine and defensive. They when they started to go back and the German attacked and the Russians started to move back into the Russia, they didn't even have maps, because all the maps printed and issued to the troops, to officers, were maps of Europe. They didn't know, it was complete disarray. So that's why first several months of the war were so dramatic and so ruinous for the Soviet army. that's couple of, it's just an interesting moment. I doubt that anybody knew about this.
No, I appreciate that, those remarks, very interesting.
The book is written by a Russian writer. His name is Suvorov. And I read a couple of books about Stalingrad, defense of Stalingrad. It was totally different view, not what I learned in school. What they taught us was different stories altogether. And all the names that you mentioned, all the heroes, obviously I knew them. It was put in our hands. You could wake me up in the middle of the night and I'll tell you who was Matrosov, Kosmodemyansk, and everybody, and Gastello and everybody.
I have to say, it's intimidating giving this talk in front of people who obviously knew a lot more than I did. I mean, I came at this as an amateur, but so I appreciate the input, and I hope I didn't make too many errors in that.
No.
Michael, I just wanted to, we're going to wrap up, I think, in a minute or two, but I just wanted to say one thing myself, that the gentleman, I didn't catch his name, and I apologize. I see his face there. Let me just, Robert, I think makes a very interesting point about the stamps and about propaganda, because I think for many people, there's an implicit pejorative, if you like, spin on propaganda. You know, you say the word propaganda and you think of German propaganda. You think of, oh, that's not fair. What are they, you know, that's lies. But one man's propaganda is another man's rally to arms, rally to defend your country. So I think it depends on which side of the, you know, which side of the line you're sitting on. And I'm still looking, by the way, for the stamp from the movie Charade with Cary Grant. If you ever run into that, some of you may, few of you may know what I'm talking about there. But Michael, absolutely fascinating talk, like on so many different levels. History, of course, but the stamps themselves, the propaganda aspect of them, the myth, the reality, and sincerely one of the best talks I think we've had, and we've had so many. All of the talks have been terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
And thank you all for joining us tonight and for your comments and your input. Hopefully we'll see you in May. Look for an email coming up. Pat Johnson is next up on May the 13th.
Thank you for all the effort you're putting in.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And to David Schwartz, our magician behind the curtain. Thanks, David, once again, for all the work that you put in with Zoom and everything else with the Men's Club. Thank you, folks. And most of all, stay safe and stay well.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Bye all.
Thank you. Sunroom, I think. Yeah. How do I leave? I can't leave here.